for coming on my show. I appreciate it, on Signed, Sealed, and Delivered. And I have with me today Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert, Derek, and Sharon. You guys have quite a cool background. You guys are keep yourselves very busy with your show, one of my favorite shows, SciFriday on SkyWatch TV. And why don't you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Well, let's see. You go.
Okay. Well, we met over the internet back in 1997 at a time when only 20% of America was online. So we were early adopters. And the long version of the story, which we'll condense here, is that if I had filled out the...
Sam just came into the room.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, we love pets.
Sam T. Doxson. Yes, he's our agent. And we actually met on an online dating site. Both of us were single and not by choice. But long story short, if I'd filled out the questionnaire that they ask when you sign up differently, if I checked the box that said I was only willing to travel 50 or even 100 miles, we would never have met. Wow. I checked the box that said 200 miles, and I'm not even sure why. I just thought, well, she's somebody I'm willing to spend the rest of my life with. Turned out later we found that as I was in St. Louis and she was in Bloomington, Indiana, we lived about 195 miles apart. So God had his hand on all of that, bringing us together.
Did.
We do believe that. We believe the Lord brought us together.
Yeah.
Well, you guys make a great team. I mean, I've read, I'm reading Bad Moon Rising, and I know, Mr. Gilbert, that you have also written Last Clash of the Titans, along with several other things. And Mrs. Gilbert, you have written Ebola and the Fourth Horseman of the Apocalypse, and you both have, and your Red Wing Saga series. Mm-hmm. And I know you both recently co-authored Veneration, which I have right here, which is an amazing book. So you guys make a great team.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really enjoyed writing Veneration together, researching it. It's really built on a lot of the research he was doing for Bad Moon Rising and Last Clash of the Titans and The Great Inception. But also I was doing the same research. We were talking here at home for the Red Wing Saga because we were looking at spiritual warfare, which almost from the get-go in March of 2005, when we started podcasting, we were both looking at that. We had PID radio, which stands for Peering into Darkness. We've always felt like our calling has been to try to see what the enemy is doing in the spirit realm, because that's where all of this is taking place. It touches our material realm, but the spirit realm is where the real war is taking place.
Yeah.
Now, what I find interesting, though, is that what I like about your book is you go back and you talk about it from the very beginning. And what struck me is the whole world, it appeared back, and when we have the earliest of documents, thousands of years ago, it seemed like pretty much every culture believed in a god of some sort, big G or little g, mostly little g's. Mm-hmm. But and that was widespread and it was well documented. And then it seemed like we went through this time of, they call it the Enlightenment era, but it's more like the dark ages of belief, I think. So talk a little bit about that.
What's really odd about that is the Enlightenment followed the fall of Constantinople, and I document this in Bad Moon Rising. In 1453, we who studied Western civilization in high school and college, we have got a very Eurocentric view of history, and we forget that for centuries after the rise of Islam in the early 7th century, that Christendom, which is a term that we really need to bring back because it's really appropriate.
It means the kingdom of Christ.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Has been at war with Islam. And we tend to forget that. The Enlightenment was an outgrowth of the philosophies of ancient Greece, which Paul confronted during his travels through Asia. When he was on Mars Hill, he was debating with the Epicureans and other naturalist philosophers. Well, that philosophy, after the rise of Islam in the 7th century, was sort of contained because travel from the east, the remnant of the Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, to the west was really dangerous. And so,
wow.
And so it was only after Byzantium fell, Constantinople fell in 1453, that many of the Greeks and their libraries made their way to the West. And suddenly the Western Europeans, the Germans and the French and the English, began reading these things and saying, hey, they're onto something. And suddenly this naturalist worldview, that there's a natural scientific explanation for everything in creation began to propagate through Western thought.
Yes, but here's the thing. We know from what Jesus tells us that when you sweep out a house and you clean it, then the demons that were swept out are going to bring all their buddies back in. When the Enlightenment period supposedly brought us to a humanist and logic naturalist worldview, it was swept out.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of the demons came back in and they called themselves other things.
Right. That's a really good observation, because what the neo-atheists like Richard Dawkins are discovering now is that the future, now that they've put a spike, they think, in Christianity here in the Western civilization, Europe and North America, it's not going to be the Star Trek atheist future where religion is just superstition that we've outgrown. It's going to be replaced with a new paganism. And Sharon really made this case very strongly, I thought, at last year's SkyWatch TV Defender Conference, in which she argued that the ancient spirit of Inanna, or Ishtar, or as she's called in the Bible, Ashtoreth, Astarte, is the spirit of our age. So, yeah.
Well, you see that. Do you think that that's where a lot of this, I mean, it's interesting because you do see that there are a lot of people turning away from following Christ, but they are going into a lot of these new age philosophies. It's not like they're even abandoning their belief in another realm. They're just choosing to reject that, that belief for these other, and it sounds to me, the whole feminist ideology and all that seems to really, it struck me with Inanna and all her history and everything.
Well, a lot of that actually, the modern version of Inanna's kingdom, really began in about the 18th century, when you had the early roots of what's called Enlightenment. And then in the 19th century, of course, we saw a total move away from it, because we had suddenly the Industrial Revolution that led to our own information technology revolution. And the Industrial Revolution and all of the new inventions helped to cement science as the new God. And when science took over, this vacuum was left in those who left religion, that suddenly they had this yearning inside them for something more than just the dry knowledge of science. They wanted to believe in something wet. And so in comes the spiritualism movement. And that led to women like Blavatsky in the late 19th century and early 20th century with
Alice Bailey.
Alice Bailey, thank you very much. And that, in many ways, set up our current alien enlightenment.
Right.
Sure. You bring up an interesting point, and you talk about Madame Blavatsky and all of that. And the thing is, a lot of times people, especially more in the godless beliefs, and sometimes that can be far leftist, sometimes that can be people even on the far right. But the funny thing is, if you look at what WikiLeaks, when we had seen, the email communications regarding, Hillary Clinton, Tony Podesta, I mean, they reference all of these people in spirit cooking, and they make fun of, people like us who believe and follow Christ and a Bible that they didn't even study, which if they would actually look at it, statistically speaking, the prophecies that have come to pass, it's almost impossible for them to have come to pass the way they have and not be real. But they don't, they laugh at us, but look at what your own leaders are doing. They believe in this too. They are into spiritism a lot, right? Am I right in saying that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it manifests in a number of ways, as Sharon pointed out, and as you pointed out, the spirit cooking, which is plainly pagan in its origin, but even the modern ancient alien hypothesis, which is sort of taken as given now by many inside the UFO research community, just derives directly from the teachings of Blavatsky and Astarte, which were recycled for fiction by the horror author H.P. Lovecraft, and his stuff was essentially repackaged by a couple of Frenchmen in the 1960s named Powles and Bergier, and their stuff was recycled to the point where he was sued for it by Eric von Daniken. So Chariots of the Gods, Zechariah Sitchin, all of that comes out of 19th century spiritualism and Gnosticism. And it is so even in what appears to be a modern scientific movement like the UFO community, you see the roots of paganism bearing fruit.
let's back up for just a second, because I'm sure some of my viewers are like, we're throwing so many names around. They're probably like, wait, who is this? And, they're getting their crayons out and trying to connect dots here that they, for some people that, this is new, they're watching this and they're like, Inanna, H.P. Lovecraft. So let's tell them why we brought up Inanna and who she is, or this. I know it can be more than just a female, but can you let them know who this is?
The goddess Inanna is the Sumerian version of Ashtaroth, Ishtar, and that was her old name. She was called the Queen of Heaven. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes,
she was represented by the planet Venus. She was called oftentimes the morning or the evening star, depending upon the poem. She was so powerful that supposedly she actually claimed the title, the Bull of Heaven. That's a traditionally male role, as you can imagine. But she also claimed that she conquered the chaos dragon. Now think about in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 2, you see the spirit hovering over Tehom, over the waters. That's as Derek writes, Tehom is a cognate for Tiamat. That's the name of the chaos dragon. Inanna was claiming to have been there when that happened, and she's the one who did the smackdown.
Wow.
Inanna was, in the poems and in the plays, she was revered as a goddess who could change the left side into the right side. She could make you male or female depending upon her whim and your desire. She was the early adopter of transgender identity.
And when was this? Well, like what years?
Well, she's been worshipped in Mesopotamia going all the way back to 3000 BC. But some of these poems that Sharon is citing that we document not only in veneration, but in the previous book, Last Clash of the Titans, go back to before the Old Babylonian period, which was the time of Abraham, about 2000 BC. So we're talking the third millennium BC, between 3000 and 2000 BC. This was going on in ancient Sumer.
Okay. And now it's interesting. Some people will say, well, there was a civilization before Adam and Eve. And I know there is a pre-Adamite, a lot of people believe in the pre-Adamite civilization because of the Hebrew between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, I think it is, I believe. But a lot of times people do study the Mesopotamian and a Sumer, I can't remember how it's pronounced, but yeah, so these are gods that the ancients believed, and then going back with that, one of the things I really was interested in hearing from you guys, I wanted to ask you about the divine council because you broached that subject, but I wanted to learn more about that. I know. So I want to ask you about that, and then I want to ask you about how the churches seem to be receiving the information you're putting out there, because this is something that really needs to get out there, especially for kids. Like, kids are they sit in church, and if there's no real background, and if it's a dry account of history of God and man, and you don't teach them the stuff, that's why they go looking for this. They don't even understand the power of what they're sitting in. So can you talk a little bit about the divine council and that whole thing? And
well, this is based. Sure. This is based on the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, who built on earlier work himself, but his book, The Unseen Realm, is highly recommended. He's also got sort of an introductory version of that book called Supernatural, and Heiser spelled Heiser for your viewers who may not be familiar with his work. We highly recommend his work because it's foundational to what we're doing. All we're doing is trying to take the divine council concept and show how it applies in the Bible, and the archaeological evidence for it, the text evidence in the Bible, and so forth. The divine council concept is simple. God is sovereign. He is supreme. He is the only entity in the entire and all of creation who pre-existed creation, spoke it into existence. Everything else, all the other entities that we discuss in our books, were created by God. But
by Yahweh.
Yahweh.
When you use the English term God, it gets confusing.
Sure.
Capital G God, and we'll talk about the small g gods.
Right.
Those are the ones he created.
Right.
Yes.
So he created a...
we call them angels.
Right. There you go. Yes. Good.
But that term is kind of flattens it out into like a one-dimensional representation of what's really going on in three dimensions, well, multiple dimensions, 11 dimensions.
I like calling them Elohim. That's a term that is used in the Bible, and Dr. Heiser uses it as well. Representatives of an unseen realm.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's a designator of place. It's not it's not a title or a name. So Yahweh created all of these entities as sort of a royal court. And we see evidence of the divine council a couple places in Scripture in particular. We see it in the book of Job, where Satan is wandering to and fro on the earth, and he comes up to heaven with the other sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, which is a term in the Old Testament. When you see that phrase, sons of God, it always, underline always, means angels or spirit beings, Elohim.
Mm-hmm. When it's plural, sons of God.
Right.
Sons
when
of
it's
God.
singular, when it's singular, it occasionally refers to the pre-incarnate Christ.
Mm-hmm. So, one like a son of man in the book of Daniel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that is we see it again in Psalm 82, which is an important chapter, because right there in Psalm 82 you see God takes his place in the midst of the gods. Elohim stands in the midst of the Elohim. The word Elohim is like the word sheep or deer in English. It can be singular or plural depending on the context. Okay. But Psalm 82 is really a courtroom scene where Yahweh is condemning these small g gods for not judging humanity, not ruling over them correctly, properly, fairly. He's showing they've been showing partiality to the wicked. And so he says to them, though you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Now, what is that referring to? Well, as Dr. Heiser points out in the Unseen Realm, this refers back to a couple of incidents that relate to the condition of the world in which we live. If you ask a Christian today, why is the world in such a sorry state? Well, it's because of the fall in Eden, Genesis 3. A first century Christian or first century Jew living at the time of the Jesus and the apostles would have said, well, yeah, that's important. But then you've also got the fall in Genesis 6, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were fair and took wives of all they chose, and from them came the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty men who were of old. Mm-hmm. Then you got the fall in Genesis 10, which was the Tower of Babel incident, where man tried to create an artificial sacred mountain or cosmic mountain as a portal to connect with the gods. In my first book, The Great Inception, I show how this concept of the holy mountain or the Mount of Assembly is key all the way throughout the Bible. The original Mount of Assembly was Eden. In Ezekiel 28, we see Eden described as the mountain of God. Humanity was ejected from the mountain because of what happened in the garden on Eden. Okay. Babel was an artificial mountain. Mount Hermon, where according to the book of First Enoch, the Watchers, the sons of God who descended, made a mutual pact to take wives of human women and create the giants. That was another cosmic mountain. There was the mountain that was sacred to Baal. There, of course, was Mount Sinai, where Moses encountered God. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the final mountain is Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is where Armageddon will be. Well, after on Mount Hermon, God sent the flood and rebooted humanity with Noah and his family. But then a couple of generations later, Nimrod at Babel tried to create this artificial mountain to create a point of contact with these small g gods. Mm-hmm. God, in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, it says in the most recent English translations, and this is based on older texts of the book of Deuteronomy found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. When God numbered the nations, or divided the nations, he numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. Now, most English translations say the number of the sons of Israel, but again, the Dead Sea Scrolls say sons of God. In fact, the older Septuagint translation, which was translated from older Hebrew texts into Greek by Jewish scholars about 200 years before the birth of Christ, it says the number of heavenly beings. So they understood the number that these angels, these small g gods, were placed over the nations. And we see this specifically in Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 and 20, when God warned Moses not to allow the Israelites to venerate or worship the sun, the moon, all the host of heaven, things that are allotted to the nations. So in other words, what happened after Babel, when God divided the nations, he said, okay, you don't want to deal with me, you want to deal with these entities, I'm going to give you what you want. But guess what? It's not a reward, it's a punishment. So God divides the nations. Each nation gets its own patron god, which was the custom in Mesopotamia, by the way. And we even see this reflected in the Bible. The national god of Moab was Chemosh. The national god of Ammon was Molech or Milcom, and so on.
Wow.
But God reserved Israel, Yahweh reserved Israel for himself, which is why the Old Testament reads like a history of the entire world against Israel. We want to destroy God's chosen people, and that way we'll get this creation for ourselves.
And that's why God
in Psalm 82
took them over, yes.
Said, that's right. You're going to die like men and fall like any prince. And we show in the show in Last Clash of the Titans, and also here in Veneration, where end times prophecy points to this. We see it referenced in Isaiah, where the sun and the moon will be shut up with the host of heaven for many days, and after many days they will be punished. And other places where these entities will fall. In Veneration specifically, we look at the demonic spirits of the giants created by those rebellious sons of God, and the role that they play in end times prophecy. All of this is about these rebel small g gods and their children, the Nephilim, from whom their spirits, the demons that plague the earth to this day, were created, against God and the children he created, which is you and us and all of humanity. And who's going to be standing after the last trump? Oof. That's what this whole war is about.
And
so
if kids in church understood that, they would be so excited about reading the Bible.
Right.
And maybe a little bit frightened to make sure, I mean, to me, so the world was divided up among these gods. Are those gods still ruling those nations today?
Yes,
absolutely.
But people obviously just don't. I mean, there are people, obviously, there are groups that are in the Middle East or around the world. Like, I mean, the Hindu religion, they have tons of, little g gods, Elohim. But so that is such a fascinating way to look at it. So he divided the world up because it was as a punishment for them trying to connect with them. But we are we are the ones that fall under God.
Exactly. That's the thing to remember. And another thing to remember is that these small g gods who were put in charge of the rest of the world, they don't get along. They war against one another all the time. We're told they were put in charge of the nations, that's tribes, not countries with little dotted lines around them. These are tribes. And since that day, those tribes have moved around a lot. And they've been at war with one another, and they've taken over one another's territory. They've invaded each other. That whole original scenario, that original arrangement, it's all mixed up now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think at some point in the end, even though they're fighting, they'll adopt? And is there anywhere in Scripture that they will adopt the enemy of my enemy as my friend and all come together to come against Israel?
Well, that was my whole point in the book Bad Moon Rising. My argument is that Islam itself is was an alliance by the gods, the small g gods, who were taken by surprise by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. As Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6 through 8, if the rulers of the age, if the archons, and it's pretty clear in the context, I think, that he was not referring to the political leadership in Jerusalem or Rome. He was talking about the principalities and powers, these unseen entities behind the tribes. If they had understood the mystery that God was revealing through they would not have crucified Jesus Christ.
Oh, I'm sure.
They didn't get it. And so they sent him to the cross, completing his mission. And suddenly they're like, oh no, because as Peter writes in 1 Peter 3, verses 19 and 20, when he was, after the crucifixion, in the Spirit, Jesus descended and proclaimed to the prisoners. Now, who is he talking about? Well, he's talking about those spirits who had been confined in the abyss since the days of Noah. In other words, these watchers, these angelic beings who descended to Mount Hermon and took human wives, who've been chained in gloomy darkness, according to 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude verses 6 and 7. Jesus, and I love the way Mike Heiser puts this, I'll bet you didn't expect to see me here, but here's the news flash. At dawn, 30, I'm still dead. And so these spirits who were still on earth, the one were placed over them. Suddenly, they had to regroup. Oh, what do we do now? And then in the 7th century, they found their man in Muhammad and was the birth of Islam.
Yes, but let me just explain, not all of the earthly entities got together for Islam.
No.
Only a few of them.
Right.
Some of them remained with Christianity and eventually became, the big hierarchical organizations. Right. Some of them remained out of Christianity and out of Islam, and they started sects within Judaism, and where they started what we call pagan sects, now Judeo-Christian sects across the world. They did not belong then. A few of them cooperated to form Islam, but I think even within Islam, they're still fighting.
Oh, sure. You got the Shia-Sunni divide and other sects.
But a day will come when they realize, oops, he's about to come. We'd better all get together and look up because he's our enemy. They're going to think that at the battle of Armageddon that they can take him out, but they're not. Praise God, no matter what happens, he is still in control. Nothing takes him by surprise.
Right.
Wow. Absolutely. That is amazing. That is truly amazing. And then now we are fast forwarded to our modern time and what's going on now. And in my next episode, I'm going to break this up into 2 episodes. I would like for us to talk about that, and we can go on here in just a second